So you have the United States, a first-rate military power, and yet its economy is seriously slipping. What does that mean, first-rate military power, second-rate economy?
Well, it means that in a certain sense, killing and the use of force abroad becomes even more important for the U.S. than it was before. But it's even that edge, I think, may not last for too long. After Reagan invaded Grenada, he said, "Now the U.S. is standing tall. Now we can be proud." After the U.S. invaded Iraq, General Wesley Clark, who later became a leading politician in the Democratic Party, said, "This shows that we cannot be challenged. No one can dare to defy us." Well, Reagan turned out to be right, because after Grenada, the U.S. launched a series of attacks on soft targets, places that couldn't really defend themselves, like Panama, Nicaragua, many other places. But Clark turned out to be wrong, because the U.S. was essentially defeated in Iraq. Essentially rebuffed. What initially looked like a victory turned into a disaster for U.S. Power, and now it's not the case that the U.S. can just drop a hint to a given country, and they have to fear that the U.S. parachutists will be dropping the next day. And that is something that opens up possibilities for the world. It's something that we have to take advantage of.
The tax compromise, the bill that was passed, more than $800 billion, who it helped, it extends the Bush-era tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans, reduces the estate tax in return for a 13-month extension for jobless benefits, a handful of tax credits for low and moderate income Americans, at least a quarter of the tax savings going to the wealthiest 1% of the population. The only group that will see taxes increase are the nation's lowest paid workers. Talk about who benefits in this country and the trend that's going on in this country.
Well, there's a remarkable trend now, this mania for what they call austerity among almost the entire U.S. intelligentsia. Everyone saying, "Oh, we have to cut the deficit. We have to cut back."
The most hit word in the Merriam-Webster dictionary is the word austerity.
And the meaning of austerity. The usual understanding of that word is cutting back on luxuries. And that's a good thing. That would be a good thing if the U.S. were to cut back on luxuries. Well, you can't cut back on luxuries unless you have luxuries. And the people who really have luxuries are the U.S. Rich. But those who push austerity are not talking about cutting back on luxuries for the rich. They're talking about cutting back on necessities for working people and the poor. So at a time when the U.S. Department of Agriculture is documenting increasing numbers of American families that report experiencing some days of hunger in their household, at a time when U.S. schools are turning out fewer students who are good at reading and math and logical thinking, especially as compared to students from other countries. At this precise time, what does the entire U.S. intelligentsia say with one word? Cut Social Security, cut unemployment insurance, cut food stamps, cut the public schools, cut the opportunity to get higher education, as opposed to saying, have real austerity, cut the luxuries of the rich. In a way, it's a little puzzling, in a way, because the overall economic effect of it is to cut at a time when you should be expanding. In the midst of a recession, conventional capitalist economic theory says you have to stimulate, you have to expand. Instead, they're talking about going in exactly the opposite direction. In a way, I mean, this is just kind of speculation, but there may be some connection to the military troubles the U.S. is having. Because, you know, in American politics, and among American intellectuals who deal with politics, you always have to prove you're a tough guy. You always have to prove you're willing to be harsh, you're willing to make the tough choices. And for most of recent history, that's been proven by backing various wars and invasions and support for repressive regimes overseas. You know, you would prove you were tough-minded by backing that. Now, after what happened to the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan with their military failures, it's a little embarrassing to go down that route to prove your toughness. So today, to prove you're tough, you talk about, oh, we have to make painful choices on entitlements. We have to make painful choices on Social Security and Medicare. They don't mean painful for the people who have the money. They mean painful for the people who don't.
The United States spends nearly as much on military power as every country in the world combined, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. We spend more than 6 times as much as the country with the next highest budget, which is China.
Yeah, but that's a very interesting state of affairs, because it'll be hard for the U.S. to sustain that. Because, okay, they spend the money on weaponry, but where are they going to make those weapons? Because the entire movement of U.S. corporations in recent years has been to shift their industrial production of everything overseas in search of the cheapest, most repressed, most terrorized labor they can find. And military equipment is an industrial good like any other. And before long, it's going to become increasingly more and more uneconomical for the U.S. to try to make that military equipment domestically. And it's going to be harder to control that technology. You know, but that also, that economic shift has some good implications. You know, it's especially striking when you've been overseas for a while and you come back to the U.S. You see that there's, especially among the U.S. upper middle class, there's this whole lifestyle, this whole green cyber lifestyle where everybody's got their iPad and their iPod and, you know, their eye this and their eye that. But if you look at what is behind that, you know, the coltan, the minerals that are used to make the components for that, that's mined in the Congo, where the workers are virtual slaves. The manufacturing of those you know, electronic gadgets is no longer done in the U.S. It's done in places like China. The iPhone made in Shanghai, for example. So what lies behind that is fun for the upper middle class who are playing with the gadgets, unemployment for the U.S. workers who don't make them anymore, virtual slavery for the Congolese workers who were extracting the minerals under the lash. But on the Chinese end of things, and in other comparable economies, it's a slightly different and more interesting story in one sense. There's tremendous exploitation of these Chinese workers after they shifted away from communism in the strict economic sense and made the capitalist opening. Labor rights declined in China. This was according to a study by a corporate-sponsored think tank there. Even under the strict communist dictatorship of Mao, workers in China had more rights than they did in the initial years of the capitalist opening that began with Deng. But now, that picture is starting to change. There are labor shortages in China. There have been a series of actions by workers. They're not allowed to organize unions, but there have been, in effect, wildcat strikes, riots, workers so driven to despair that they commit suicide. This in particular at Foxconn, one of the companies that makes components for the iPhone. All sorts of turmoil around Chinese labor. And in response, the government has had to make big concessions to them. They got severance pay. The migrant workers who come in from the countryside are now allowed certain rights in the city that they didn't have, about the schooling of their children, about social welfare, without yet having legal unions. They are starting to make progress, and they're generating upward pressure on wages. Now, that is profound, because China is such a large and growing percentage of world production, that upward pressure on wages out of China is going to ripple everywhere. It's going to ripple all the way to Indonesia, all the way to Haiti, and all the way to the U.S. This started about 2.5 years ago, and even though U.S. labor has been all but crushed politically, and that's what's making these attacks on Social Security and the schools and Medicare possible, because American labor isn't there to defend them anymore. The middle class that labor helped create is badly weakened. Even though that's the current situation, there's kind of a reinforcement coming, and that is upward pressure on wages by the new activity of workers in the very politically repressed China, and this inevitably will be spreading to other places. So it's actually a very hopeful development to look out for, and that people can be looking to take advantage of.
Allan, we have to break. When we come back, I want to ask you about WikiLeaks, the largest release of secret documents in the history of this country. We're speaking with award-winning journalist, activist Allan Nairn. He lives overseas, has just come back for a week to this country, returning to Asia in just a few days. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. We'll be back with Allan in a minute.